Welcome to our deep dive into a landmark judicial review claim brought by Mark Cohen, represented by Lawrence Kurt Solicitors. This case challenges the decisions and ongoing conduct of the Crown Prosecution Service, or CPS, in a complex investigation involving McLaren Construction Group plc. At its core, the claim raises serious questions about investigative independence, disclosure obligations, and the role of private entities in public prosecutions. Over the next several scenes, we'll unpack the facts, legal arguments, and broader implications for justice and police conduct in the UK. The case centres on Mr. Mark Cohen, the claimant, who is challenging the CPS's handling of an investigation tied to McLaren Construction Group plc. Lawrence Kurt Solicitors, based in Birmingham, act on his behalf. Defendants include the Director of Public Prosecutions and the CPS, with the claim focusing on their reliance on material and investigative work provided by private firms, notably Edmonds Marshall McMahon, Taylor Wessing LLP, and Repton Security. These private entities were initially retained by McLaren before police involvement, raising concerns about the independence and objectivity of the subsequent criminal investigation. Application for judicial review was submitted under Part 54 of the Civil Procedure Rules. The claim specifically targets the CPS's decisions regarding disclosure, investigative independence, evidential review, and procedural fairness. The claimant argues that the CPS unlawfully relied on classifications and assessments made by EMM, a private prosecution firm acting for McLaren, instead of conducting their own independent review of the evidence. This, it is alleged, undermined the fairness and legality of the prosecution process. Claim challenges several key decisions by the CPS. These include accepting EMM's categorization of thousands of documents as privileged or irrelevant without independent review, proceeding with prosecution despite not reviewing all material, and maintaining that disclosure obligations were satisfied. The claimant asserts that these actions represent a failure to exercise independent prosecutorial judgment and a breach of statutory and human rights obligations. For police involvement, McLaren Construction Group retained EMM, Taylor Wessing LLP, and Repton Security to conduct investigative work. These private organisations gathered evidence, engaged witnesses, and developed investigative theories. Much of their material was later incorporated into the public investigation. Disclosure Management Document reveals that EMM held over 10,000 documents, with more than 6,700 classified as privileged or irrelevant, and not supplied to the prosecution. The CPS relied on EMM's assurances without further scrutiny, a central issue in the claim. Legal framework underpinning the claim includes the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996, CPIA, which imposes duties on investigators and prosecutors to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry and independently review disclosure material. Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights guarantees a fair trial, including procedural fairness and adequate disclosure. The claim argues that the CPS's actions breached these fundamental legal standards. First ground alleges that the CPS misdirected itself regarding its disclosure obligations. By treating EMM's classifications as sufficient, the CPS failed to independently review material, contrary to non-delegable public duties under the CPIA. The claim asserts that the CPS's reliance on a private firm's assessment, without direct examination of the underlying documents, was a fundamental legal error. Second ground claims the CPS unlawfully fettered its discretion by substituting EMM's judgment for its own. Prosecutors are required to independently assess relevance, privilege, and evidential significance. The CPS's acceptance of EMM's categorizations, without independent scrutiny, is argued to be an abdication of statutory responsibility and a failure to exercise proper prosecutorial judgment. Prosecutorial independence is a constitutional requirement. The claim alleges that the CPS adopted investigative conclusions and material from private entities without sufficient scrutiny, failing to exercise independent judgment. This ground highlights the importance of public authorities maintaining autonomy from interested third parties to preserve the integrity of the criminal justice process. Claim further argues that the CPS failed to consider evidence suggesting alternative suspects and explanations, and did not pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry as required by law. The disclosed material identified alternative suspects and explanations, but the CPS allegedly did not investigate these with due diligence. This failure is said to undermine the fairness and completeness of the investigation. Sixth and seventh grounds allege that the CPS's decisions were irrational and procedurally unfair. Despite knowing that thousands of documents had not been independently reviewed, the CPS concluded that disclosure obligations were satisfied. The claim asserts that no reasonable prosecutor could have reached this conclusion without a proper review process, making the decision both irrational and unfair. Claim raises concerns about apparent bias, arguing that the involvement of private organisations acting for McLaren created a perception of partiality. Article 6 of the ECHR, which guarantees fairness and equality of arms, is said to have been breached by the cumulative effect of these failures. The process, the claim argues, gave rise to a real possibility of bias and undermined the fairness of the proceedings. Claimant seeks a series of declarations from the court, including that the CPS acted unlawfully, failed to independently review material, and breached Article 6 ECHR. Further relief and costs are also sought. The aim is to ensure accountability and reinforce the importance of independent, fair, and lawful conduct in criminal investigations and prosecutions. Alongside the judicial review, a formal complaint was lodged with the West Midlands Police Professional Standards Department. This complaint alleges misconduct, failure of investigative independence, disclosure failures, and lack of supervision in Operation Granite. It names specific officers and raises concerns about the influence of private organisations, the handling of evidence, and potential breaches of professional standards and human rights. This case highlights fundamental issues in the UK justice system: the need for investigative independence, transparency, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. The outcome will have significant implications for how public authorities interact with private entities in criminal investigations and the safeguards required to maintain public confidence in the fairness and integrity of the justice process.